His mistake happened in front of everyone. On the big night of the Entrepreneur of the Year awards in São Paulo, the arrogant CEO, Roberto, was about to receive the top prize. When a waitress bumped into his table, he publicly humiliated her, saying she almost ruined everything. Minutes later, the host called to the stage the anonymous judge Min, who decided the winner, and to Roberto's horror, it was the waitress who started walking toward the stage. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a universe unto itself, an ocean of crystal and gold where the waves were the contented murmurs of the Manhattan elite. Monumental chandeliers poured a warm, golden light onto impeccably set tables, transforming champagne flutes into tiny, shimmering constellations. The air vibrated with anticipation for the grand night, the Titan of Industry Award, and at the center of this galaxy of power and influence, Robert Sterling reigned supreme. Seated at the head table, he was the sun around which all other planets seemed to revolve. His suit, a bespoke Armani, was as dark as his ambitions, and the smile on his lips was a masterpiece of self-assurance. He didn't hope to win. He knew he would. The victory was a mere formality, the coronation of a year in which his vast fortune had grown exponentially, driven by aggressive Wall Street investments that had made him a market legend. His sycophants, a tight circle of executives and socialites, laughed at his every quip, each word received as if it were a decree. Eliza moved through this dazzling scene like a silent shadow. Her black and white server's uniform made her part of the invisible machinery that kept this world of luxury running. Her silver tray floated with practiced grace between the islands of animated conversation, her ears catching fragments of dialogue about interest rates, dividends, and the latest crypto coin promising instant fortunes. She served hors d'oeuvres and refilled glasses with a discreet efficiency, her serene face hiding the constant assessment she made of every gesture, every glance, every tone of voice around her. Her eyes, a deep and observant brown, missed nothing. She saw the way Robert dismissed an assistant with a contemptuous wave and the forced smile he offered a potential rival. To everyone there, she was just another employee, easily ignored, but in her silence, she held the power of a verdict. As she approached Robert's table to pour more water, the inevitable happened. A guest, gesturing enthusiastically about his profits in international stocks, took a step back without looking, bumping hard into Eliza's arm. It was a sharp, violent motion that upset her carefully controlled posture. The tray wobbled dangerously, and a single, solitary drop of ice-cold water escaped the pitcher. Landing with treacherous precision on the sleeve of Robert's immaculate suit, the spot was minuscule, almost imperceptible on the dark fabric, but the CEO's reaction was like the detonation of a bomb. "You incompetent fool," he bellowed, his voice slicing through the ballroom's buzz like a blade. A sudden, heavy silence descended upon the room. Every head turned toward the explosion. "Look what you've done. You've nearly ruined my night. Do you have any idea what this suit costs? More than you'll make in your entire life. Security, get this useless woman out of my sight." The humiliation was a physical blow, hot and paralyzing. Eliza felt the stares of hundreds of people on her, a mixture of pity, embarrassment, and morbid curiosity. Her face burned, but she held her head high, her eyes locked on Robert, who was glaring at her with glacial contempt. Before the security guards could take a step, the velvety voice of the master of ceremonies echoed from the speakers on stage. "And now, the main event, the reason we are all gathered tonight, to present the Titan of Industry Award. Let's call to the stage the person whose vote holds a 90% weight in the final decision. She has been among us all year, undercover, evaluating not just the numbers and the assets, but the character and integrity of our finalists. Please, a warm round of applause to welcome our anonymous evaluator, Eliza Vance." Robert's paralysis was total, an instantaneous petrification that froze the arrogant smile on his lips. The name Eliza Vance ricocheted inside his skull, an impossible anomaly, a system error in his perfectly calculated reality. He watched, with a surreal detachment, as the waitress he had just crushed with his scorn handed her silver tray to an assistant who had appeared as if by magic. Her every movement was slow, deliberate, laden with a meaning he was incapable of processing. With a calm that was a direct insult to his growing panic, she untied the knots of her apron. The simple fabric fell to the floor, and underneath, a midnight blue silk gown of a cut so elegant and understated it screamed more wealth than any ostentatious jewelry, molded her form. It was like watching a butterfly emerge from a mundane cocoon. The entire ballroom held its breath collectively, a single shocked organism, witnessing the metamorphosis that dismantled all their certainties. She didn't rush to the stage. She walked. Each step was firm, her posture erect, her chin high. She was no longer an invisible servant. She was a queen reclaiming her throne. Robert felt the blood drain from his face, leaving behind a damp chill. The ringing in his ears drowned out the murmurs that began to ripple through the audience. He, the man who controlled boardrooms with a glance, who moved markets with a phone call, who had built an empire on his ability to read people and anticipate moves, had been deceived in the most fundamental way possible. She had been there, all along, watching, every meeting, every business lunch, every gesture of false cordiality. The humiliation from moments ago now seemed small, insignificant before the abyss opening at his feet. His net worth, his assets, the mountain of money that defined his existence. It all felt fragile, vulnerable to something he had never considered a real threat: the judgment of his character. The woman he had treated like trash was, in fact, the judge, jury, and executioner of his professional destiny. On stage, Eliza took the microphone, and the silence returned, denser and heavier than before. Her eyes met Robert's across the ballroom, and there was no triumph or anger in them. There was a cutting clarity, a serenity that terrified him more than any fury. "Good evening, everyone." Her voice, now amplified, was steady and melodic, devoid of any trace of the nervousness he would have expected from a waitress. The Titan of Industry Award is more than a recognition of profit or capital growth. It is for a leader. She paused, and the word hung in the air, weighted with meaning. And a true leader knows that the real value of a person and of a company is measured by how we treat those who, seemingly, can offer us nothing in return. Each word was a direct hit, a public dissection of his moral failure. Mr. Robert Sterling has given us, tonight, an unequivocal and unforgettable demonstration of his character. Then she held up the sealed golden envelope. The award, the symbol of everything he had worked, manipulated, and fought for. The apex of his career. With a simple, devastating gesture, she tore it in half, the sound of ripping paper echoing through the sepulchral silence of the ballroom. The two halves fluttered from her hands like dead leaves. The awards committee has decided that this year, for the first time in our history, the award will not be given. A collective gasp swept through the audience. The title of Titan of Industry is officially vacant. The blow was final, the sentence delivered. But then Eliza looked at him one more time, and her face held a new expression, one that chilled him to the bone. It wasn't the end. She leaned into the microphone, her voice lowering to an almost intimate tone, yet one that everyone could hear. "And as for your conduct, Mr. Sterling, the evaluation is not over yet." Eliza's final words, "The evaluation is not over yet," hung in the air like the smoke from a gunshot. For Robert, the entire world contracted to that single point, a black hole sucking all the sound, light, and air from the monumental ballroom. He remained standing, or perhaps floating, unable to feel the floor beneath his Italian leather shoes. The ringing in his ears was the sound of his empire crumbling, not the empire of assets and capital, but the empire of self, the fortress of his ego he had considered impregnable. The faces around him transformed into a grotesque tapestry of shock, malicious delight, and worst of all, pity. He saw in the eyes of his peers no longer the reflection of a billionaire to be feared and admired, but of a fool who had tripped over his own pride. The wealth he had accumulated, the fortune built on bold moves and calculated cruelty, now felt like paper armor in a torrential downpour. What were his assets, his hedge funds, his dollars tucked away in offshore accounts, in the face of this public annihilation of his identity? A wave of fury rose in his throat, hot and bitter as poison. Who was she? Who was this woman to dare judge him? He, Robert Sterling, who had turned a small inheritance into a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. He, who understood the cash flow of the global market like a maestro understands his orchestra. Anger was a familiar reaction, his default defense against any threat. He opened his mouth to shout, to dismantle her charade, to expose her as a fraud, but no sound came out. His authority, his most potent weapon, had been neutralized. Meanwhile, Eliza descended from the stage with the same grace with which she had ascended. She didn't look at him. Her indifference was the final slap. She moved through the ballroom, and people parted to make way for her, like the sea parting for a force of nature. She disappeared through a side door, leaving behind the chaos of her revelation. The spell broke. The whispers began, first like the buzzing of bees, then growing into a clear, audible murmur. Robert felt the stares like needles on his skin. The men at his table, who minutes before had been toasting his inevitable success, suddenly found a deep interest in their watches or the ceiling decor. No one would meet his eye. He was alone, isolated on an island of humiliation. He had to get out, now. With a jerky, uncoordinated movement, he pushed his chair back, the sound scraping on the marble like a scream. He turned and walked, almost running toward the exit, not looking to either side, focusing only on the promise of escape through the grand, gilded archway of the ballroom. Every step was torture, every yard a journey through a minefield of judgment. He could hear fragments of conversations. Character is worth more than any net worth. The stock market is going to react to this tomorrow. All that fortune for what? When he finally reached the foyer, breathless, a figure stepped into his path, blocking his escape. It was not a reporter or a rival, but someone much closer. Clara, his personal assistant for over 20 years, the middle-aged woman, always discreet and efficient, who organized his life with robotic precision, stood there, her face impassive, but her eyes, normally submissive and neutral, held a glint he had never seen before, a cold, unwavering resolution. She no longer looked like his employee, she looked like a sentinel. In her hands, she held a tablet. Mr. Sterling. Her voice was calm, devoid of any emotion, which made it all the more chilling. Miss Vance asked me to give you this. It's the second part of your evaluation. She turned the screen toward him. On it, a document was open, and the title made what was left of his blood run cold. Moral and Financial Integrity Audit, the Legacy of Robert Sterling. The words on the tablet glowed with a cold, accusatory light. Moral and Financial Integrity Audit. To Robert, the phrase was an absurdity, a contradiction in terms. Morality and finance were two universes that, in his mind, should never intersect. Business success was a game of numbers, of profitability, of maximizing returns at any cost. Integrity was an empty word, used by the weak to justify their failure. He looked at Clara, his assistant, the woman whose name he barely remembered using in recent years, referring to her mentally as the efficient one. Her face, once a blank canvas of subservience, was now that of a stranger. The loyalty he had bought with a generous salary and annual bonuses had been revealed as a sham. She wasn't his employee. She was a spy in his most intimate sanctuary. "What is the meaning of this?" he hissed, his voice a tatter of its former authority. "What kind of sick joke is this, Clara? You're fired." Clara didn't flinch. Her eyes showed no fear, not even surprise. "With all due respect, sir, you're not in a position to fire anyone tonight," she replied, her voice as calm as a surgeon's before a delicate incision. "Miss Vance, or rather, the board she represents, initiated this audit 18 months ago. My job was simply to facilitate data collection." The word data struck him. He thought of spreadsheets, cash flow, investment projections. But Clara's gaze told him this data was of a different nature. "This is a corporate attack, an attempt to manipulate my stock price. I'll sue all of you," he threatened, desperation beginning to corrode his rage. He was a man accustomed to fighting with the weapons of capital, not conscience. "This isn't about your business, Mr. Sterling. At least, not directly," Clara continued, relentless. "This audit doesn't evaluate your assets or your net worth. It evaluates the human cost of your fortune." She swiped her finger across the screen, and a new page appeared. It was a photo. The photo of a small neighborhood bookstore with a charming, old-fashioned facade. Next to it, a document, an eviction notice. Robert felt a vague sense of recognition. "Pendleton's Books," he read aloud. "I bought that building 5 years ago. An excellent deal. The land was worth a fortune." He remembered demolishing the old structure to erect a modern, profitable office tower. So what? That's how the market works. Progress. Progress! Clara's voice gained a steel edge. The owner was a 70-year-old man, Arthur Pendleton. The bookstore was his life, his father's inheritance. He begged you for an extension, for a chance to relocate. He sent you letters, tried to schedule meetings. You never responded. You used your lawyers to crush him with fees and lawsuits until he gave up everything. He lost not only his business, but his home, which was in the back of the shop. Robert stared at her, stunned. How did she know that? It was an insignificant detail, a footnote in his billion-dollar ascent. "That's irrelevant," he spat, feeling the cold sweat on his brow. Clara took a step forward, and for the first time, Robert instinctively recoiled. The plaza's foyer, once a symbol of his status, now felt like a marble cage. "Nothing is irrelevant, sir," she said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "Every action was recorded, every decision, every life you impacted to increase your dividends. And this audit isn't just for the board's eyes." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "The first part of this report, focusing specifically on the Pendleton's Books case, will be sent to your daughter, Sophia, in exactly 1 hour. She always did love bookstores, didn't she?" The name of his daughter, Sophia, hit Robert with the force of a physical impact, knocking the wind out of him. If the humiliation in the ballroom had been a wound to his pride, the mention of Sophia was a knife twisted directly in his heart. Sophia was his true north, the one point on his moral compass he had tried, clumsily, to keep intact. She was the reason, or at least the justification, for his relentless pursuit of more money, more power, more security. He had built a fortress of wealth around her, a fortune so vast it would protect her from any hardship the world could throw at her. But now, the very bricks he had used to build that wall were being hurled back at him, and she would be the first one hit. The irony was cruel, almost poetic. He had destroyed a small, insignificant bookstore to optimize the profitability of an investment, and that very act now threatened to destroy the image his daughter, a lover of books and paper worlds, had of him. The memory of her at 7, her eyes shining in an old bookstore in Paris, the smell of old paper and promises, hit him with a painful clarity. His mind, trained to find solutions and exploit weaknesses, snapped into emergency mode. The paralysis gave way to a feverish urgency. He looked at Clara, no longer as the judge of his character, but as an obstacle to be overcome. He resorted to the only language he truly mastered, that of power and money. "Clara, listen," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, trying to create a bubble of complicity in the middle of the foyer. "Whatever they offered you, I'll beat it. I'll double it, triple it. Name a number. You want $1 million? 2? You want company stock? I can transfer a crypto wallet to you right now. Anonymous, untraceable. Just stop this. Delay sending that email. Give me 24 hours. He was offering her a small slice of his fortune, convinced that everything and everyone had a price. It was the bedrock of his world. Every loyalty, every principle, every relationship was just a transaction waiting to happen. Clara looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something resembling pity in her eyes. She shook her head slowly. "Mr. Sterling, and there are some things money can't buy, and some debts it can't pay," she said, her voice soft but unshakable. "My cooperation in this audit wasn't a business deal, it was a choice. Arthur Pendleton, the owner of the bookstore, he was my uncle." Robert's world tilted on its axis. The detail, the personal connection, was something his calculations could never have foreseen. That insignificant old man wasn't an anonymous stranger. He had a face, a family, a niece who had spent the last 2 decades silently chronicling her boss's every transgression. The web was far more intricate than he had imagined. He wasn't fighting an awards committee. He was fighting the human consequences of his own actions. Desperation swallowed him. 1 hour. He had less than an hour to stop the daughter he loved more than his entire net worth from seeing the unvarnished truth about the father she idolized. The truth that he was a man who crushed the dreams of others to pave his own golden path. He couldn't reason with Clara. He couldn't hack the system. The only thing he could do was try to get to Sophia first, try to explain, to soften the blow, to control the narrative. It was a slim chance, almost non-existent, but it was the only one he had. Ignoring Clara and the tablet she still held like a digital tombstone, he pushed past her, his body moving on sheer instinct of paternal self-preservation. He tore his phone from his pocket, his fingers trembling as he dialed his driver. The voice that answered on the other end heard a command unlike any he had ever received. It wasn't the tone of a billionaire giving an order, but of a man running from a fire. "Anthony, to Sophia's apartment. Now, forget the traffic, forget the rules. Fly." The drive to Sophia's apartment on the Upper East Side, overlooking the park, was a blur of city lights and the blare of the luxury sedan's horn. Robert was in the back, but not leaning into the plush leather seats as usual. He was hunched forward, his body tense, his eyes fixed on the passage of time, on the gold watch on his wrist. Each second was a drop of acid eating away at the pristine image he had built for his daughter. He tried to formulate sentences in his mind, rehearsing a defense for the indefensible. "It was just business, sweetheart," sounded weak, pathetic. "Sometimes, to build something great, you have to make sacrifices," sounded like the excuse of a tyrant. The truth was, he had never thought of Arthur Pendleton as a person. He was a liability on a spreadsheet, an obstacle to maximizing profit, a number to be eliminated so that other numbers, those of his net worth, could grow. How could he explain that cold, inhuman logic to the girl he had taught to be kind, to donate to charity, to treat everyone with respect? He had been living a monumental lie, and the wall separating his ruthless corporate world from his family life was about to be pulverized. He remembered a conversation with Sophia a few weeks prior. She had been beaming, talking about her volunteer work at a non-profit that promoted literacy in underserved communities. "Dad, you can't imagine the joy on a kid's face when they get their very first book," she had said, her eyes shining. "It's like giving them a key to the universe. It's an investment in their soul." The word investment had made him smile at the time. She was learning his vocabulary. Now, the memory haunted him. He had destroyed a place that was someone's soul, A small universe of paper and dreams, and for what? For a slightly more robust cash flow in one of his countless real estate projects. The dissonance between the man Sophia believed him to be and the man he truly was a chasm so deep it threatened to swallow him. He looked out the window at the city he saw as his personal chessboard and, for the first time, saw the small lights in the apartment buildings not as real estate assets, but as homes, filled with lives and stories he had always considered irrelevant to his grand plans. When the car finally screeched to a halt in front of Sophia's elegant building, Robert jumped out before Anthony could even open the door. He didn't wait for the doorman, storming through the lobby like a hurricane, ignoring the stunned, "Good evening, Mr. Sterling's." In the private elevator, he jabbed the button for the penthouse with unnecessary force, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had minutes, maybe seconds. The elevator doors opened directly into a spacious living room, decorated with an impeccable taste that was his daughter's hallmark. And there she was. Sophia was sitting on a white sofa, her back to him, wearing headphones and looking at a tablet in her lap. The same posture, the same device. Robert's blood ran cold. Too late. He was terribly, catastrophically, too late. She didn't hear him arrive. He stood frozen a few feet away, a statue of despair. He could see the glow of the screen reflected in her glasses. She was engrossed, her body still, indicating a deep concentration. Robert's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, to snatch the device from her hands, but his feet were nailed to the floor. He was an intruder at his own catastrophe. Slowly, as if surfacing from a deep dive, Sophia lifted her head. She seemed to sense his presence in the room. She turned, and the movement was slow, almost reluctant. When her eyes met his, there was none of the shock or anger he had expected. There was something far worse. There was a profound sadness, a disappointment so vast and ancient it seemed to have aged her young face in a matter of minutes. In her lap, the tablet screen still glowed, and on it the photo of the small bookstore. "Dad!" Her voice was a fragile, broken whisper. "What did you do?" Sophia's question, "Dad, what did you do?" wasn't an accusation. It was the sound of a pillar crumbling, the lament of a broken faith. For Robert, it would have been easier to face fury, screams, recriminations. He knew how to fight anger, but the sorrow in her eyes was an adversary against which he had no defense. He stood there, the billionaire accustomed to commanding the world, completely disarmed by his own daughter's pain. The living room, which he had gifted her as a symbol of his success and love, now felt like a courtroom. Every piece of art, every designer furniture item, every inch of the luxury surrounding them was a silent testament to the tainted source of his wealth. The words he had rehearsed in the car turned to dust in his mouth. "Sophia, he began, his voice hoarse, foreign to his own ears. "I can explain." "Explain," she repeated, the word devoid of hope. She removed her headphones, the silence filling the space between them, heavier than any noise. She slid her finger across the tablet screen, and a new page of the report appeared. It was a transcript, a series of emails between his lawyers. "Reject the proposal. Initiate eviction proceedings immediately. Ignore all attempts at contact. The target's emotional cost is irrelevant to the financial outcome." The language was his. Cold, surgical, brutally efficient. It was the language he used to build his empire, but read here, in the stillness of this apartment, it sounded like the language of a monster. "I read it all, Dad," Sophia said, her voice thick with emotion. The letters Arthur Pendleton wrote. He wasn't asking for money, he was asking for time. He talked about his grandfather, who built those shelves with his own hands. He talked about the neighborhood kids who learned to read there. He wasn't a liability, he was a person. The revelation that Clara was Arthur's niece had been a shock, but seeing the story through Sophia's eyes was an entirely different experience. To him, it was a business transaction gone awry. To her, it was a parable of cruelty and greed. The disconnect between their perspectives was an unbridgeable chasm. Suddenly, a new notification flashed at the top of Sophia's tablet. It was an email. The sender, Eliza Vance. The subject, Integrity Audit Part 2, the Appalachian Ridge Project. Robert's heart plummeted. He knew exactly what that was. It was one of his largest investments, a mountaintop removal mining operation, a project that promised astronomical returns but came with complications. He had used all his power and influence to keep those complications far from public and regulatory eyes. Before Sophia could touch the notification, an impulse of primal panic seized Robert. He took a step forward, his hand outstretched. "Sophia, don't read that, please." The desperation in his voice startled her. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. "Why? What's in there that's so terrible it's worse than destroying a man's life for a piece of land?" she asked, her sadness giving way to a hint of defiance. That email contained details he never, ever wanted her to know. Details about contaminated rivers, about displaced communities, about environmental reports that his capital had influenced. They were the dirty foundations upon which part of his most recent fortune had been built. If the bookstore story had cracked the pedestal she had placed him on, the Appalachian Ridge Project would demolish it completely. But then something unexpected happened. Robert's phone, which he still held in his trembling hand, vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. He opened it on pure reflex. The message contained just one sentence. "Don't worry about the email. Your daughter won't read it. Look out the window." Confused, Robert turned to the immense glass walls of the apartment, which offered a panoramic view of the city. Across the park, atop one of the tallest commercial buildings in Midtown, a building he recognized as the headquarters of his greatest rival. Marcus Thorne, a giant digital billboard, which normally displayed luxury ads, flickered and changed. The image of a Rolex watch was replaced by the cover of the audit report, with his name in massive letters, and below it, in a digital ticker that scrolled slowly for the entire city to read. The story of Pendleton's books began to unfold. The evaluation was no longer private. It had become a public spectacle. The image on the digital billboard was monstrous, a luminous wound in the New York City night sky. Robert Sterling's name, once synonymous with power and business success, was now plastered for millions to see, associated not with record profits or brilliant investments, but with the destruction of a small bookstore. It was a high-tech nightmare, a humiliation on a monumental scale. He felt the floor disappear from under him, the vertigo of total exposure unbalancing him. The war was no longer about an award or his daughter's disappointment. It had escalated into a public annihilation of his reputation, the most carefully constructed asset of his entire career. Every car driving along Central Park South, every resident in the neighboring buildings, every person with a phone and access to social media would, in minutes, be a witness to his downfall. His stock price would plummet at the market open. His fortune, which had seemed so solid and eternal, was vulnerable to the tide of public opinion. Sophia, following his gaze, let out a choked gasp. She stood up and walked to the window, standing beside him, the two of them watching in silence as the narrative of his moral failure unspooled in giant LED letters. The intimacy of their pain had been stolen, turned into entertainment for the city. Who would do something like this? She whispered, more to herself than to him. His question was different. Who had the power and the audacity to do this? Displaying something on that scale required not just money but significant influence, access to resources that few possessed, and the answer came to him with a terrible clarity. Marcus Thorne, his rival, The man he had outmaneuvered for contracts, whom he had humiliated at negotiation tables, the eternal second place in the race for the Titan of Industry title. The anonymous text, the billboard on Thorne's company headquarters. The pieces fit together with a perverse logic. Eliza Vance and her committee weren't acting alone. They had a powerful ally, someone who saw in Robert's fall a golden opportunity. A new kind of anger began to bubble in his chest, replacing the panic. It was a cold, focused rage. He was no longer the victim of a moral crusade. He was the target of a savage corporate attack, disguised as justice. Marcus was using Eliza's audit as a weapon to destroy him. "I know who it is," Robert said, his voice hard, the strategist inside him waking from its emotional stupor. "It's Marcus. He's behind this. He's using this woman, this Eliza, to take me out of the game." He turned to Sophia, his eyes flashing with a new determination. "This isn't about an old man and his bookstore. It never was. It's about power, about control of the market. And I'm not going down without a fight." But Sophia wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were still fixed on the spectacle across the park, but her expression had changed. The sadness had given way to a kind of desolate clarity. "Even if it is Marcus," she said, her voice low but firm, "even if he's using this to attack you, it doesn't change what you did, Dad. The story that's playing on that screen, it's true, isn't it?" The simple question disarmed him completely. He wanted to deny, to paint the situation in shades of grey, to talk about the complexity of the business world, about the aggressive tactics of his competitors. But faced with his daughter's unwavering sincerity, the excuses sounded hollow in his own mind. The truth was the truth, no matter who was using it as a weapon. Before he could answer, Sophia's phone rang. She looked at the caller ID, and her face tightened in confusion. "It's Grandma," she said, Robert's mother, a frail 80-year-old woman who lived in a luxury nursing home and whom he shielded from any stress or disturbance. He felt a spike of ice in his veins. "Don't answer it," he said, his voice urgent, but it was too late. Sophia had already swiped her finger across the screen. "Hi, Grandma. Is everything okay?" There was a pause, and Robert could hear the trembling, anxious voice of his mother on the other end, even from a distance. "Yes, I'm with Dad," Sophia continued. Another pause. Then Sophia's eyes widened, locking on his, filled with a new and terrible understanding. "What? Grandma, what are you talking about? What does Arthur Pendleton, the bookstore owner, have to do with Grandpa?" Sophia's question was like a trap door opening beneath Robert's feet, sending him into a freefall through decades of carefully suppressed memories. Her grandfather's name, his own father, spoken in the same breath as Arthur Pendleton, the bookstore owner, created an impossible connection, a short circuit in his reality. He snatched the phone from Sophia's hand with a brusqueness that startled her. "Mom, what did you say? Where did you hear that name?" he demanded, his voice strained, trying to maintain calm as an icy dread spread through his body. On the other end of the line, his mother Eleanor's voice was a fragile thread of confusion and fear. "Robert, dear, they're showing some awful things on the television about you." And they said his name. "Arthur Pendleton, the son of Mr. Pendleton from the bookstore. Don't you remember, dear? The bookstore where your father loved to spend his afternoons. Every word was a hammer, shattering the shell of his past. Pendleton's books. It wasn't just a real estate asset on a spreadsheet. It was a real place from his childhood. A dusty memory, stored in a dark corner of his mind, began to gain color and sound. He saw himself, a boy of maybe 8 or 9, holding hands with his father, a simple, dreamy man whose small capital never blossomed into a fortune. His father wasn't a businessman. He was a reader, a man who found more wealth in books than in any balance sheet. And Pendleton's books was his treasure trove. Mr. Pendleton Sr., Arthur's father, was an old man with thick glasses who always had a piece of candy in his pocket for little Robert. And Arthur Arthur was the older boy, the owner's son, who would sometimes help him reach the books on the highest shelves. The memory was so vivid he could smell the old paper and waxed wood. He had blocked it all out in his climb to become the opposite of his father, a man of action, of profits, of ruthless deals. He had buried the boy who marveled at stories and the father who cherished them. The purchase of that building years ago had been just another transaction on a long work day. His assistants presented him with the numbers. The location was strategic. The ROI on demolition and new construction was high. The name Pendleton's Books had triggered no alarms, evoked no memories. It was just a name on a contract, an obstacle to be removed. Now, the truth hit him with the force of a self-betrayal. He hadn't just destroyed a stranger's business, he had demolished his own father's sanctuary. He had erased one of the few legacies of kindness and simplicity he had ever received, all in the name of a fortune that now felt dirty and meaningless. "Mom, I have to go," he said, his voice cracking. "I'll call you later." He ended the call before she could reply, the silence in the room weighing a ton. Sophia was watching him, her eyes wide, filled with questions he didn't know how to answer. The billboard across the city was no longer a weapon of his rival. It was a mirror, reflecting not just his cruelty as a businessman, but his failure as a son. He had become so focused on accumulating assets, on growing his net worth, that he had completely disconnected from his own roots, his own history. He sank onto the sofa, the energy drained from his body. The fight was over. Marcus Thorne could have the market, the contracts, the empty title of Titan of industry. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the disappointed face of his father in his memories and the devastated expression of his daughter before him. He had betrayed them both. Then Sophia's tablet, forgotten on the sofa beside him, chimed softly. A new message had arrived, overlaying the cover of the audit report. It wasn't an email. It was a calendar invitation from Eliza Vance to Robert Sterling. Subject, final evaluation meeting. The location listed made what was left of his blood freeze. It wasn't an office or a boardroom. It was the address of a vacant lot, surrounded by construction fencing. Exactly where, 5 years ago, Pendleton's Books had stood, and the time was 1 hour from now. The drive to the designated address was the opposite of the frantic race to Sophia's apartment. This time, the silence inside the car was thick, meditative. Robert asked Anthony to drive slowly, as if delaying his arrival could somehow alter what awaited him. He said nothing to Sophia about the invitation. He just murmured that he had to leave, that he needed to think. She didn't protest. She just watched him go with those sad, knowing eyes, a silent judge in his own home. As the car glided through the city streets, the billboard with his name still glowed in the distance, a beacon of his shame. But now, the public humiliation felt secondary. The real battle was happening within him, a confrontation with the ghosts of his past, the image of his father. A man he loved, but whose disdain for the material world had driven him to a life of excess, was superimposed on that of Arthur Pendleton, whom he had turned into a reflection of his father. A good man, crushed by the impersonal gears of capital that he and Robert Dean controlled. He arrived at the location. It was no longer a vacant lot. The construction fences had been removed. In the place where there had once been the dust and rubble of his ambition, there was now a small garden, simple, well-kept, with wooden benches and flower beds illuminated by low, discreet lampposts. And in the center, built with bricks reclaimed from the original demolition, stood a low, single-story structure with large glass windows that radiated a warm, inviting light. It was not an office tower, it was a library. A discreet bronze plaque beside the door read, "The Raymond Sterling Community Library." His father's name. Robert stepped out of the car, his legs unsteady, and walked slowly toward the entrance, his heart a confusing mix of dread and a strange, fragile hope. The door opened before he reached it. Eliza Vance stood in the threshold, not in a server's uniform or a couture gown, but in a simple, elegant pantsuit. Her gaze was not one of accusation, but of calm expectation. "Mr. Sterling, we were waiting for you," she said, her voice soft. She stepped aside, inviting him in. The interior was even more surprising. Light wood shelves filled with new and old books lined the space, creating a welcoming labyrinth. There were reading tables, comfortable armchairs, and in one corner, a children's area with colorful rugs and cushions. And sitting at one of the tables, speaking in low tones, were three people. He recognized Clara, his former assistant, immediately. Beside her, an older man with white hair and a time-worn face, but with kind eyes that Robert recognized from a half-forgotten childhood memory, Arthur Pendleton. And the third person was his mother, Eleanor. She stood up when she saw him, her face creased with worry, and something else, something he couldn't decipher. "Robert, my son," she said, approaching him, "they brought me here. They said it was important for me to be here." Robert looked from his mother to Arthur, from Arthur to Clara, and finally to Eliza, who observed the scene in silence. His mind, trained in business strategies and hostile takeovers, struggled to comprehend the situation. This wasn't an attack, it wasn't a trap. It was something else. "What is all this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, his gesture encompassing the building, the people, the plaque bearing his father's name. It was Arthur who answered. He stood and walked toward him, no anger or resentment in his expression. There was only a weary dignity. "For 18 months, Ms. Vance and the committee she represents have done more than just investigate your business, Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice calm and steady. "They used the funds that would have gone to the award and many other resources to try to mitigate some of the damage. They found me. They listened to my story. And they built this." He looked around at the books, at the legacy of his own father intertwined with that of Robert's. "This doesn't undo what happened," Arthur continued, looking Robert directly in the eye. "But it is a beginning. The question, however, that the final evaluation needs to answer is, a beginning of what?" The silence that followed was filled with a single, heavy question. The choice wasn't about saving his business or his fortune. It was about deciding what kind of man he would be from that moment on. Arthur's question, "a beginning of what?" echoed in the silent space of the library, disarming Robert in a way no accusation or threat ever could. He looked around at his mother's face, watching him with a mixture of love and supplication, at Clara, whose posture was no longer one of defiance but of quiet expectation, at Arthur, the man he had stripped of everything, who now offered him not forgiveness, but a crossroads, and finally, at Eliza, the architect of this entire situation, whose expression remained serenely unreadable. This place, built on the ruins of his own cruelty, was the physical manifestation of all he had lost and all he could, perhaps, begin to build. The Raymond Sterling Community Library was more than reparation. It was a mirror reflecting the futility of his pursuit of meaningless wealth. He had built towers of glass and steel, cold monuments to capital, while they had built a haven for the soul, a legacy that honored the memory of a simple man who loved books. Robert began, his voice failing. "I don't understand. Why do all this? The public humiliation, the billboard, the exposure, and then this." He felt like a man who, expecting the executioner's final blow, is instead handed a map to an unknown path. The humiliation, Mr. Sterling, was never the end goal. It was a necessary tool, Eliza said, stepping forward. "Your fortress was too high, your walls too thick. We needed a seismic shock to create a crack, to let a little light in. We needed you to lose something you valued, your reputation, your control, so that you could see what truly matters." She gestured toward Eleanor and Arthur. "This is not a courtroom. It's a meeting, the most important one of your life. We are not here to audit your assets, but to discuss your liabilities, not the financial ones, but the human ones." A flashback hit him with the force of a wave. He was in his 20s, sitting at the kitchen table with his father, Raymond. He was proudly showing his father his first big profit on the stock market, a gain that surpassed his father's annual salary. He had expected admiration, a pat on the back. Instead, his father looked at the numbers with a gentle sadness and said, "Son, never forget that behind every number on a spreadsheet, every stock that rises or falls, there is a person, a dream, a family, a fear. If you forget that, you may gain the world, but you will lose your soul." At the time, he had dismissed the words as the naive sentimentalism of a man who didn't understand business. Now, decades later, in the library bearing that same man's name, the wisdom of those words crushed him. His mother approached and, with a gesture she hadn't made since he was a child, touched his cheek. "Robert, your father would have loved this place," she said, her eyes welling up. "He never wanted an inheritance of money for you. He wanted to leave a legacy of character." Looking at Arthur was the hardest part. In this elderly man, he saw not only the victim of his greed, but the guardian of a memory he himself had desecrated. He had turned his father's friend's son into an invisible enemy, collateral damage in his war for more. "Mr. Pendleton." "Arthur," Robert said, his voice thick, the formality crumbling. "There are no words, no interest or dividends that can repay what I took from you. What I did was unforgivable." Arthur studied him for a long moment, his kind yet shrewd eyes searching past the expensive suit and the facade of power. "The unforgivable thing, Mr. Sterling, is to continue on the same path after you've been given a chance to see the abyss," he said with a quiet wisdom. "This place," he glanced around, "isn't mine. It belongs to the community. It belongs to the memory of our fathers. Your evaluation, I believe, depends on what you do when you walk out that door. Whether you'll sue your rival for the exposure, or whether you'll try to fix the cracks in your own foundation." Then, Eliza took a final step forward, holding a single document. It was not a report, nor a contract. It was a blank sheet of paper with a pen. "The committee has left the last page of your evaluation blank," she said. "It is to be written by you, with actions, not words. The billboard will be turned off in 5 minutes. What appears in its place tomorrow and in the days to come is up to you." The blank sheet on the wooden table was the most intimidating object Robert had ever faced. On it, there were no clauses, no figures, no profit projections. There was only an infinite void, a reflection of his own moral bankruptcy. The silence in the library was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of city traffic, a reminder that the world outside kept spinning, indifferent to the collapse of his private universe. The billboard, he knew, was dark now. The public humiliation had ceased, but the real judgment, the most terrifying one, was happening right here, under the warm lights of this sanctuary built on his own ashes. For an instant, the old Robert, the creature of instinct and aggression that had carried him to the top, screamed inside him. The rage surged, clean and familiar. Marcus Thorne, that worm, was behind the exposure. Vengeance would be simple, a work of art of corporate destruction. He would mobilize his lawyers, leak information, start a war on the stock exchange that would pulverize Marcus's net worth. He could turn his rival's assets to dust. But then he looked at his mother. Eleanor wasn't looking at him with expectation, but with a profound fear. The fear that the son she loved was lost forever inside the billionaire he had become. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of his father, Raymond, and the inheritance he had rejected. The true inheritance wasn't in bank accounts or investment portfolios. It was in quiet integrity, in the character that withstands the easy temptations of power. He had spent his entire life trying to prove his father wrong about the world, only to discover, in this moment of ruin, that his father had been right about the soul. His gaze moved to Arthur. The impulse to pull out a checkbook, to offer an obscene amount of money, a compensation that would make him feel powerful again, died in his throat. It would be the final insult. He no longer saw a removed obstacle, but a man who, like his father, found wealth in things that couldn't be bought. Community, history, dignity. Offering money to Arthur would be like trying to pay the ocean for its tides. Finally, he looked at Eliza, the woman who had orchestrated his downfall, and for the first time, he didn't see an enemy. He saw a force of nature, an embodiment of a universal law he had always ignored, the law of consequence. She and her mysterious committee hadn't just pointed out his mistakes. They had spent significant capital, not to destroy, but to build. They had invested in a possibility of redemption. They weren't interested in his money. They were interested in his humanity. The understanding hit him with overwhelming force. The evaluation had never been about whether he was worthy of an award. It had been about whether he was worthy of himself. Slowly, like a man moving underwater, he walked to the table. He didn't pick up the pen. Instead, he took his phone from his pocket. His fingers, which had once trembled with rage and panic, were now steady. He dialed a number from his contacts, that of his head of communications, a man paid to spin narratives and protect Robert's public image at all costs. The man answered on the first ring, his voice anxious. "Mr. Sterling, we're ready to release the statement on Thorne's attack. Our lawyers cancel it all," Robert said, his voice calm and clear, resonating in the library's silence. "Prepare a new release. To go out in 1 hour, no spin, no blaming anyone." He paused, looking at the plaque with his father's name. "The statement will say that I, Robert Sterling, take full responsibility for my actions in the case of Pendleton's books. It will say that it was a grievous and inhuman error, and that I publicly apologize to Mr. Arthur Pendleton and his family." Everyone in the room held their breath. "Furthermore," Robert continued, "announce that I am taking a temporary leave of absence as CEO of all my companies, and that my first act, before I step down, will be to establish a social investment fund with an initial endowment of $100 million from my personal fortune, to finance community and cultural projects that have been negatively impacted by real estate speculation in the city. The first beneficiary will be the Raymond Sterling Community Library." He ended the call and placed the phone on top of the blank sheet of paper. He looked at Eliza, at Arthur, at his mother. "The first line," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "is written." The statement fell on New York's business world like a silent bomb. Where war was expected, a confession arrived. Where retaliation was anticipated, reparation was offered. The news spread like wildfire. Robert Sterling, the ruthless titan of the market, the man whose name was synonymous with profit at any cost, had admitted fault. He had asked for forgiveness, and most shockingly, he had put a significant portion of his fortune where his words were. The financial market, an entity that only understands the language of strength and weakness, was stunned. His company's stocks, which everyone expected to plummet, wavered for a moment and then stabilized, as if Wall Street itself were holding its breath, unsure how to price redemption. Marcus Thorne, caught completely off guard, saw his attack strategy disintegrate. How do you attack a man who has already surrendered, not to you, but to his own conscience? Any move by Thorne would now seem petty, opportunistic. Robert, in an act of apparent weakness, had executed the most brilliant strategic move of his career, disarming his enemy by disarming himself first. But to Robert, none of that mattered. For the first time in decades, he wasn't thinking about stocks, markets, interest rates, or his net worth. As he hung up the phone in that library, he felt a weight he hadn't even known he was carrying lift from his shoulders. The relief was so profound, so overwhelming, that he had to sit down. His mother was crying silently, tears not of sorrow, but of a pride he hadn't seen in her eyes since he was a boy. Arthur approached and, in a gesture Robert would never forget, placed a hand on his shoulder. There were no words, just a silent acknowledgement that the cycle of pain had been broken. In the days and weeks that followed, Robert moved through a world that was both familiar and entirely new. He kept his word, stepping down from the leadership of his empire and formalizing the fund's creation. He worked not with his top-tier executives, but with Clara, whom he asked to run the foundation. Their first task was to meet with Arthur to structure the support for the library. In those meetings, Robert wasn't the billionaire CEO, he was just a man learning to listen. He listened to Arthur's stories about the neighborhood, about the kids who needed a safe place to study, about the elderly who felt lonely. Each story was a small brick rebuilding the empathy he had allowed to atrophy. His relationship with Sophia underwent a delicate transformation. The wound was still there. The disappointment didn't vanish overnight, but her father's public confession and, more importantly, his subsequent actions opened a door to reconciliation. One afternoon, she showed up at the library, where he was helping to catalogue a book donation. She said nothing at first, just watched him work, the man she had seen command boardrooms now with book dust on his hands. "I saw what you did, Dad," she said finally, her voice soft. "I always wanted to be proud of you for your success. But today, for the first time, I'm proud of you for your character." Those words were more valuable to Robert than all the dividends he had ever received in his life. The mysterious Eliza Vance and her committee vanished as silently as they had appeared. The evaluation was over. There was no final report, no verdict. The proof of his transformation wasn't in a document, but on the shelves of a community library, in the smile of a child discovering a new book, in the newfound respect in his own mirror. He didn't know who they were, whether they were a secret organization of philanthropists or a group of ethical investors. But he understood their purpose. They weren't monster hunters. They were awakeners of humanity. The Titan of Industry Award, for that year, remained vacant, but Robert Sterling, in the quiet of his personal journey, had won something far greater, a second chance to define what it meant to be a man of value. A year later, the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was glittering once again. It was the night of the Titan of Industry Award, and the buzz was even more intense than the previous year. The story of the vacant award, of Robert Sterling's humiliation and subsequent redemption, had become a legend in the corporate world, a cautionary tale and, for some, an inspiration. Robert was there, but not at the head table. He was at a more discreet table in the back, not as a finalist, but as a guest. He wasn't wearing a designer suit, but an elegant, simple one. Beside him were his mother, radiant, Sophia, whose smile was genuine and full of warmth, and Arthur Pendleton, who looked at all the luxury with an amused curiosity. Clara was there too, not as an assistant, but as the executive director of one of the most respected social foundations in the country. They were an unlikely island of serenity and genuine connection in an ocean of ambition and networking. Robert no longer spent his days obsessing over cash flow or the profitability of his businesses. He had appointed new CEOs, people he and Clara had chosen not only for their financial acumen, but for their integrity. His role now was chairman of the board, a guide to conscience. He spent most of his time working with the foundation, discovering that the return on investment from a literacy project or a cultural center brought him a satisfaction that no multi-million-dollar deal ever had. His fortune, though slightly smaller, now generated a different kind of profit, one that couldn't be measured in dollars or euros, but in transformed lives. He had discovered that true wealth was not in accumulating, but in distributing. The master of ceremonies took the stage. Last year, this award went unclaimed. he said, his voice echoing through the ballroom. It was a moment that forced us all to reflect on what truly defines a leader. This year, the board has decided to create a new category, an honorary award, the Legacy and Transformation Award, for someone who has demonstrated that a leader's true capital is not measured in assets, but in human impact. An expectant silence fell over the audience. Robert had no idea what was coming. He was just there to support a new cycle. This award goes to a man who, in the last year, has taught us that it is never too late to rewrite your own story, who has shown us that vulnerability can be the greatest of strengths and that the true measure of a fortune is the good it can do. The Legacy and Transformation Award goes to Robert Sterling. A genuine, warm applause erupted, far different from the calculated sycophancy of the previous year. Robert was frozen, stunned. Sophia squeezed his hand tightly. "Go on, Dad," she whispered. "You've earned it." As he walked to the stage, he saw, at a table near the exit, a woman with brown hair and observant eyes. She gave him a discreet smile and a slight nod. Eliza Vance. He nodded back, a gesture of silent gratitude. On stage, holding the crystal trophy, he looked out at the audience. He didn't see competitors or targets. He saw people. He thought of the blank sheet of paper. His story wasn't finished, but he knew the next pages would be filled not with the figures of his net worth, but with the names of the people he could help. "Thank you," he said, his voice firm and clear. "My father once told me that if I ever lost sight of the people behind the numbers, I would lose my soul. I spent many years lost. Tonight, I just want to say, Dad, I'm finally coming home.